A quiet afternoon took an unexpected turn when an elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, heard a soft knock at her door. Opening it, she found two young twins, no older than 7, standing on her porch with anxious faces. Their small hands clutched each other tightly, and their wide, tear-filled eyes told her something was deeply wrong. At first, she thought they were lost, but their words quickly unraveled a truth she never could have imagined. "Please," one of them whispered, "we need to tell you something. It's about our parents." What they said next left Mrs. Thompson frozen in shock. Her world turned upside down in an instant. Who were these twins, and why had they come to her of all people? What secret had they uncovered? Stay tuned to find out. Mrs. Thompson knelt down, trying to steady her trembling hands. "What do you mean, about your parents?" she asked gently, her voice laced with concern. The twins exchanged a nervous glance before the boy spoke again. "They told us never to come here," he murmured. "But we found something in the attic, something that had your name on it." His twin sister pulled out a crumpled envelope from her small backpack. The edges were worn, as if it had been hidden away for years. Mrs. Thompson's heart raced as she read the faded handwriting. It was unmistakably her late husband's. "How do you have this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl bit her lip. "We don't know, but we think you're part of the reason our parents are scared." Mrs. Thompson stared at the envelope, her mind spinning with questions. She hadn't seen her late husband's handwriting in decades. Why would these children, complete strangers, have something so personal? The boy took a step closer, his small voice steady but uneasy. "Our dad said this place is cursed," he said. "But we don't think that's true. We've heard him and Mom arguing about you." Mrs. Thompson's chest tightened. She had no idea who these children or their parents were, but something about their story felt disturbingly familiar. Memories from years ago, long buried, began to resurface. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it was tied to a chapter of her past she tried desperately to forget. The twins' words poured out like a broken dam. "They said you ruined everything," the girl admitted, her voice cracking. "But we don't think you're bad." Mrs. Thompson glanced at the envelope again, hesitating to open it. "Your parents," she said carefully, "do they know you're here?" The boy shook his head. "No, they'd be furious if they knew." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Mrs. Thompson's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the past. There had been a family, years ago, who lived in the same town. A misunderstanding, a feud, a tragedy she'd always blamed herself for. Could it be them? But before she could ask, the twins froze. A car door slammed outside, and their faces turned pale. "They're here," the girl whispered. Mrs. Thompson peeked through the window and saw a man and woman approaching, their expressions dark and filled with purpose. Tension gripped the air as she realized the confrontation she had long avoided was now at her doorstep. Mrs. Thompson's pulse quickened as the couple came closer. The twins clung to her sides, their small bodies trembling with fear. She placed a protective hand on each of their shoulders, steadying herself. Whoever these people were, they had answers. Answers she wasn't sure she wanted, but desperately needed. The knock on the door was sharp and deliberate, sending a jolt through the room. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her breath shallow, before finally opening it. Standing on her porch were a man and a woman, their faces taut with anger and something else, fear. "What are you doing here?" the man demanded, his voice cold and firm. His eyes flicked to the twins, then to Mrs. Thompson, narrowing with suspicion. "They came to me," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "They said they needed to tell me something." The woman stepped forward, her expression a mix of desperation and fury. You had no right to involve her. She snapped at the children. We told you this wasn't your place. The twins shrank back, but Mrs. Thompson stood her ground. Enough, she said firmly. I don't know who you are or why you're here, but it's clear we have unfinished business. What's this about? The man hesitated, glancing at the envelope in her hand. That, he said darkly, is part of a story better left buried. You don't know what you've done. Mrs. Thompson's grip on the envelope tightened. Try me, she challenged, her voice trembling with emotion. Whatever it is, I deserve to know. The woman's gaze softened, though her voice still carried an edge. You think you're the victim, she said bitterly, but you're not. You set something in motion years ago, something that tore our family apart. And now it's come full circle. Mrs. Thompson's fingers trembled as she held the envelope, the weight of the accusations pressing down on her. She couldn't recall any moment in her life that could have caused such devastation, but the woman's words lingered, sharp and unforgiving. I don't understand, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice wavering. What exactly did I set in motion? The man stepped closer, his jaw clenched. You took something from us, he said, his tone low and brimming with resentment. Something we never got back. Before Mrs. Thompson could respond, the boy interrupted, his small voice cutting through the tension. It's not her fault, he exclaimed. We saw the papers. It was Grandpa's idea, not hers. The woman whipped around, her eyes blazing. What papers? She demanded. The twins hesitated, glancing at each other, before the girl spoke up. In the attic, she said softly. There were letters. From her husband to Grandpa. They were working together. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken truths. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. Her husband, involved in whatever this was, it didn't seem possible. I don't believe you, she said, her voice barely audible. But the doubt had already planted itself, spreading like wildfire in her mind. The man pulled out his phone and swiped through photos until he found what he was looking for. He held it up for Mrs. Thompson to see, a faded document with her husband's signature at the bottom. This, the man said, his voice trembling with emotion, is proof that your husband conspired to take our family's home. He claimed it was to settle a debt, but it destroyed us. We lost everything. Mrs. Thompson's knees weakened as the truth began to unravel. She clutched the doorframe for support, her heart pounding. But just as she began to process the revelation, the woman's next words sent another shockwave through her. And that's not the worst part, she said bitterly. Your husband didn't just take from us. He left something behind. Something we've been carrying ever since. The woman's eyes darted to the twins, and Mrs. Thompson's stomach dropped. Whatever came next was going to change everything she thought she knew about her past and her future. Mrs. Thompson's gaze flickered between the twins and their parents, her breath shallow as she struggled to process the accusations. Her husband had always been a man of principles, or so she believed. Could he really have caused so much pain? What do you mean he left something behind? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. Your husband knew what he was doing, she said bitterly. When he took our home, he also took the one thing that mattered most, our peace. We've spent years trying to rebuild, but the debt, the shame, it never ended. The twins exchanged nervous glances before the boy spoke up. But Mom, he said hesitantly, it wasn't just that. The girl stepped forward, her small hands trembling. We found another letter, she said. It wasn't from Grandpa. It was from her. She pointed to Mrs. Thompson, whose blood ran cold. I don't understand, Mrs. Thompson said, shaking her head. I never wrote to anyone in your family. The man pulled out another document, this one creased and yellowed with time. "This letter," he said, handing it to her, "was hidden with the others. It says your husband acted out of guilt. He didn't just take our home. He did it to cover up something bigger." Mrs. Thompson scanned the letter, her hands trembling. The words were unmistakably her handwriting, but she had no memory of writing them. It spoke of a debt owed, a family's future at stake, and a decision made to protect someone, a child. And then it hit her. The child. Her own. Tears welled up in her eyes as the pieces fell into place. Decades ago, her husband had borrowed money from the twins' grandfather to save their struggling family. When he couldn't repay it, he made a devastating choice: to take the family's home as collateral. But the guilt had haunted him, driving him to leave behind the only thing he thought might one day make amends: a trust fund for the twins, hidden in a bank account under Mrs. Thompson's name. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't know." The twins' parents stared at her, their anger giving way to disbelief. "A trust fund?" the man asked. Why would he do that? "To make things right," Mrs. Thompson whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's all he ever wanted." But just as the tension began to ease, the boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "There's more," he said quietly. "The letter says, there's another key, and it's hidden here." The room fell silent again, the weight of a new mystery hanging in the air. Mrs. Thompson felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The truth had come to light, but another question loomed. What else had her husband left behind? Mrs. Thompson led the family into her small living room, her heart heavy yet determined. Together, they searched every corner, and after hours of digging through old boxes, the twins uncovered a small rusted key hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The key belonged to a safety deposit box. Inside, they later discovered documents confirming the trust fund and a heartfelt letter from Mrs. Thompson's husband. In it, he apologized for his actions and explained his desperate attempt to save his family while leaving a way to help theirs rebuild. Though the pain of the past couldn't be erased, the revelation brought a sense of closure. The twins' parents, once bitter, softened as they realized the intentions behind the betrayal. For Mrs. Thompson, it was a bittersweet ending, a chance to finally make amends and heal old wounds.